we're on to the more advanced forms of sort of character animation. There's actually also a whole character animator program that the Adobe Creative Suite comes with, which we're not going to get into in this class, but this kind of gives you the basics that you'll then be able to use later if you want to get into that more fully. It's pretty amazing the things that you can do with character animator, but we're just going to stick with After Effects for just to give you the basics of it. So like I already showed you, we've parented together. So remember the parenting thing from previous tutorials. Where we've parented together all of these components. Everything is built around the torso, right? So if the torso moves, everything follows with it. So I've gone ahead and kept that kind of set up for this. But we're going to use a different tool now, which is going to be called the Puppet Pin tool. So if you want to grab a layer, so I'll just start with this layer right here, and up here in this in our toolbar up here at the top, you have the Puppet Pin tool, which is got a couple of different components under it. You want to make sure you have the Puppet Pin tool, and you just want to kind of make some joints, if you will, like places where you think, if I was going to add a joint to this knee, I could do that. So I would put the so you can obviously the knee is a place you want a joint. You also probably want one here at the hip and then maybe down here at the heel, right? And so now if I move this, so if you just, again, keep this tool visible and just you roll over your joints, now if you do that, you'll see that it moves the whole foot around on there, which is pretty amazing. And it kind of just tries to guess at what would look good for this. And so if I stretch it out like this, that's obviously gonna be like problematic and goofy, right? And so, but it does give you sort of a general like way to kind of fake animate things. So if I zoom in a little bit on this now, you guys can see how it all kind of works, right? And so, so the cool thing about this now is if I start here and I just say, okay, my figure's there, and I want it to look like it's kind of jumping, I can just move to a certain place in the timeline and then grab the pin tool again and just start dragging this thing around, and it's going to move along the joints that I created. And it's going to kind of do stuff that looks a little jumping-ish, right? So again, this is all, it's just basically bending up the photographic image that's here. And so if you look at your, if you look up here, you have all these options underneath the pin tool. So we have this mesh thing. If you turn the mesh off, then you don't see all of that little details, and it kind of gives you a better preview of what you're looking at. There's also like expansion and triangles, so if you click on the mesh button here, you can have fewer triangles of detail so that it's not as complicated if you would like. You can also expand or contract it, so you can make the mesh bigger, or you can kind of, you don't want to do that one, but you can kind of zero it in a little bit more so it's a little tighter around the leg, which might be quite useful. It's up to you. I usually would say go with like, 5 or something like that. Give you a little bit of extra outside space. And it's only going to do it to the item you tell it to. So you could have imported your whole image in here as a flat image and then animated it, but it's going to look pretty terrible because you're not going to have the same flexibility in terms of joints and stuff like that. There's also lots of other things like record options that are underneath here and things like that, but I wouldn't mess with that right now if I was you. I would just leave the mesh on or off. It's up to you how you want that to look, and then just figure out, okay, how would it work if I animated this? So one thing though is that, like if I grab this and then I stretch this thing out, I'm getting like distortion like crazy, right? So again, if I back up a little bit, now that leg is looking really long, and this just is not, it can be funny, but it's not really a very good animation, right? It looks awkward, it looks unintentional. And so if I do something I don't like, if you go in here under the mesh and under all of the deform buttons, and then you look at each pin, you're going to see all the keyframes that you have built in there. So if you need to twirl down deeper and deeper into this and adjust things, you certainly can. But like if I don't like what I just did, I'll just delete it off of there. I'll just delete the whole puppet effect, because this is just an effect that's on that particular layer, and then I can start over again. And so one thing I just wanted to show you is if you click here, you can put my joints back where I wanted them. So I'll put my 3 joints in here, and then there's this, if you look under here, there are also options for the Puppet Starch tool, which is a little bit like kind of funny, right? Think about starching things, but it makes sense if you just think, I really only want the knee and this to move. I don't want this to get all stretched out and crazy. So if you click on it, you see that it'll sort of like gives you this little symbol, and you can like expand or contract it here by using the extent button, right? And so if I add a couple of starch points to this thing, one in between the knee and the ankle, and another one here. All right, so now if I switch back to the puppet pen tool, now if I do a little animating, just click this and drag it, you can see that it's just it only is gonna move those basic kind of joints. And unfortunately, I've starched it so much that it's like, that's pretty good, right? Looking great, because that ankle is right there. Maybe if I get rid of that pin altogether, maybe something else would happen, right? So now you can see that it's kind of like it's not distorting this section in here as much as it did because of the starches there, right? And so that kind of gives you a little bit more realistic, like just moving the foot around. And maybe you want to add points between, add a point here and there, and then if you shift click, you can move both of those things at the same time. And now those two are kind of, you can animate this thing around so it doesn't look quite as awful as it did. And maybe you can make something happen with this. Again, I could starch the space between these two joints, and it would definitely change things, right? And so now, if you move it here and then you move your figure around, move your puppet basically, the starch is kind of goofing with that whole thing. And so, but it gives you a sense of how, like, you can definitely make things move around. So you can go back in and adjust the starch if you want. Just grab the Puppet Starch tool and just click on it again, and then you can just change the extent if you want to. So make it so it's not so much. You can change the amount of starch. There's a lot of different components of things that you can do that'll really just change what happens with this puppet tool, right? And so that's another way to do it, to move your objects and things like that around. One last thing is just so you know, if you want to make it look like this object's always in front of that one, you can click on the last tool in here, which is the Puppet Overlap tool, and just say, basically drop a bunch of lines in here like that. And then when I do use the Puppet tool, like if I brought this leg all the way back over here, hopefully, it won't because of the layer. But if I had if I had all of this on one layer, and I wanted to like bring this part of it up over his leg there, which, boy, that looks, there you go, that's anatomically reasonable, right? I could totally do that. Right now I can see through it, so I would actually have to go back in here and add some more like points to the Puppet Overlap tool just to see if I can get it to kind of get fixed up. So you can see that this thing is pretty wild. Like, there's a lot of stuff that you can do with the Puppet tool. And again, especially if you pair it together with parenting, you've got everything moving all at once, and that. And so, yeah, there's a million things that you can do. There's a lot of tutorials online. Remember, the Adobe site has a bunch of tutorials that you can play around with as well. And again, I think probably for us, the easiest thing for us to do is just to manually kind of rig your character and just use the hinge points. But that's up to you if you want to go crazy. You could also do things like, if you go in here and you wish you had more bending at the knees, well, I could just cut the lower leg and the upper leg apart, kind of make it look like there's a logical overlapping hinge here. And then I bring those in as separate layers, and then I can really control like where those go with parenting and everything else, and we can make stuff work that way. So again, this is After Effects and how to use it for puppet tools and things like that. We'll move on now. Once you get your character kind of to do something, we'll move on with how to make it have a background and some other techniques.